I've been tasked with redesigning a WordPress classic theme into a block theme. The client has provided website examples they liked, inspiring me to create a dynamic gallery effect featuring a slider or carousel with a Ken Burns style fade and zoom. To give the client more visual flexibility, I'll incorporate adjustable aspect ratios and alignment options for the gallery. This will enable the client to add the slider to various content types, adjusting the images based on the format or crop, allowing for a diverse image display as a header, hero section, or within content. To achieve this, I'll create a custom block enabling multiple image uploads with margin settings. This will help the client adjust spacing and alignment as needed. On the front end, I'll add some JavaScript that will enable the zoom effect and the transition fade between images. So let's dive in and I'll show you how I created this. In this tutorial, I'll be creating a custom block for the WordPress block editor using a modern WordPress build environment. So at the time of recording, I'm using WordPress 6.5, but the process should be the same for other versions. So there are some prerequisites. To create a block using this script, we'll need to use Node Version Manager or NVM, Node.js, Node Package Manager or NPM, and we'll be utilizing WordPress scripts. Now, if you haven't set up a modern WordPress development environment before, just check out the link to my other video I've created on getting set up with modern WordPress development in the top right of this video. So initially you'll need a WordPress site ready, and in this example I've created a site called customblocks.test. So I have my site open in VS Code, and using the terminal you need to navigate to your plugins directory using cd wp-content/plugins. Now WordPress provides a script package called create block to simplify block creation. And this is the officially supported tool for scaffolding a WordPress plugin that registers a block. So on the developer.wordpress.org website, you can look for create block, where you can read all about its capabilities. Now, to run the script, we can use npx to execute the script using Node.js. And the basic command structure is as follows: npx @wordpress/create block, followed by the name of your block. For a more organized setup, you can include the flag ---- namespace, and this helps group your blocks together, avoiding conflicts with other custom blocks. So in this example, I'm creating a block named fade zoom slider with the namespace set to Elliot Richmond. You might encounter errors related to Node.js versions. For instance, at the time of recording this video, the WordPress create block package requires Node 20.10. while my default is set to version 18. And here's how to resolve it. So using NVM, you can list all installed Node.js versions to see the current version that you've got running by default. And to do that, you need to just run NVM list. So my default version of Node.js is set to 18, and the create block package requires version 20.10 or higher. So I need to switch to a higher version, and in my case I'm going to use 22, as that's the latest version I have installed. So I need to run NVM use 22. Now the beauty of using Node Version Manager is if you need to install a version of Node that you don't have installed, you can simply use NVM to install that version by using the following command: nvm install 20.10. So after switching to the correct Node.js version, you can run the create block command again. This may take some time. Once done, you'll have a custom block set up in the plugins folder, and at this point you'll need to activate the plugin to see it working in the block editor. Just to conclude, if you got to this point, we've successfully created a custom WordPress block using the create block script package, and this block can now be further customized to be used in the block editor. Now that's completed, you'll notice that the finished page provides several useful commands for the development process. npm start starts the development server and watches for changes. npm run build builds the code for production, and npm run plugin zip creates a zipped version of the build files for deployment to your web server or submission to the WordPress plugins repository. So after scaffolding the plugin, you'll find the main plugin file in the plugins folder. So let's take a look at what's been generated in the file. So we have a plugin header, which contains all the metadata such as the plugin name, description, version, and author. Update these details to reflect the information you want to show. There's a conditional security check. This prevents direct access to your plugin files via a browser. Next, we have an action on the init hook, and this registers the block type using the register_block_type reference from the build folder. And for modern development like this, you need to have a build process. So if we look at our terminal, we can see that we can use npm start. This command starts the development server, watches for file changes, and deploys them into our build folder. This is where our plugin will eventually render from. using all the code that's been deployed into the build folder. When we run npm start, it monitors the src folder or source folder. You'll spend most of your time in the source folder when developing your block. In our source folder, we have various JavaScript related files, a block.json file, edit.js, index.js, view.js, and some SCS files that we'll compile down to CSS files in the build folder. Essentially, the index.js file is the first thing that gets loaded. If we take a look at it, we can see that it uses very React-like syntax. We have an import statement for a module from the WordPress blocks package. The beauty of using the create block package is that all these files have a document block at the top of the statements with links, so if you want to read more about these functions and statements in VS Code, simply press Command and click the link. This will take you directly to the documentation where you can read all about the modules and functions or statements are meant to be doing. This is a really useful feature and a good reason to use the create block package. So in the index.js file, we're importing a style.scs file, the edit function from the edit.js file, the save function from the save.js file, and the metadata from the block.json file. The metadata includes all the parameters, attributes, support settings, and other configurations for our block. Now, if we pop back to our terminal and take a look at all of these commands, they're not always easy to remember. Fortunately, we have a package.json file, which we can review. Essentially, all of the available scripts to run after installation are listed in the package.json file. If you ever forget any commands, you can simply remind yourself by looking at this file. To run these commands, you simply use npm run followed by the name of the script. For example, there are scripts here for a build, to format CSS, to create a plugin, zip, and to start. When we're developing, we'll typically use npm start. Now, in most cases, you would type npm run followed by the name of the script listed in the scripts object. However, npm start is an exception to this, and it doesn't require the run prefix. I don't know why that is, but just be aware of it. To start your development process, use npm start. For any other script, use the command npm followed by run followed by the script name. Now let's demonstrate this by creating a custom script. I'm going to add to the script object a command called hello in the package.json file, which will execute hello world. So after saving that, I'll navigate back to my plugin directory in the terminal by typing cd fade zoom slider to change into that directory. Now I can run the script by typing npm run hello. This will execute the script and print hello in the terminal. So that's how you can check what scripts and commands you can use. The script we're interested in now for development is npm start. By running npm start from the folder, it initiates the development process. Now, if no errors occur, everything is running smoothly. So what this does is it takes our source folder, compiles all the files starting with the index.js file, and compiles them into the build folder. The various files in the build folder are what WordPress will use to render the block in the back end. We don't need to worry about these files for now, so we can close that folder. What we're interested in is the source folder. We'll do all our edits for the back end in the edit.js file, and for the front end, we'll use the save.js file. We have a CSS file for controlling the styles in the back end, and another for controlling the front end. If you don't want to modify anything in the editor, the styles.scs file will be the ultimate file that overrides everything else. We also have a view.js file for controlling all of our JavaScript in the front end. Let's take a look at the edit.js file. At the moment, nothing's going to happen in the back end of my website, even though I'm developing the plugin. I still need to activate the plugin. I'll go back to my website, navigate to my plugins, and ensure to activate the Fade Zoom Slider plugin. Now I can go to one of my pages where I've set up a Ken Burns page to demo this. In the content, type / to populate the blocks, and as you can see that my block is generated by the plugin. I'll insert it and instantly we see a default name of the block and a message saying hello from the editor. If you go back to our code and check out the edit.js file, we can see what's being rendered from the return statement, which is basically this paragraph element here. This is the message that's being sent to the browser. So let's take a look at what's going on here. So since we've used the create block package, we have references to all the imports and statements that are happening in the file. Using command on a Mac, you can click on these links in VS Code and read the documentation on all the different imports. I'm not going to go into the details because that's not the focus of this video. However, I recommend that you check out the documentation if you need to know more about each each of these statements and functions. There are various modules being imported from different places. The use block props comes from the block editor, which handles everything in the block editor UI. You import modules with curly braces, and you can import multiple modules by separating them with a comma. We can see that we're importing the SCS file and the edit function, and the edit function is returning what we see in the back end. We'll touch on the save.js file later, but we can see that we're also using the use block props, which is a hook that passes all the information down the component that you're rendering, whether it's in the back end or the front end. It contains things like the class names, the name of the block you've defined, and various other information. It's important to use the use block props hook in the parent element of the block you're creating because it defines everything down through the chain. You don't want to nest use block props in a nested element. This is why it's in the parent element at the moment. Right now it's a paragraph tag, but I'm going to change it to a div element. I'll save that change. Ultimately the content of this div will change, but I'll leave it for now. If I go back to the front end and refresh the page, I'll need to place the block in my page again. We can inspect the code here and see that it's changed to a div, and we can look through the class names and see the namespace that we created, which is Elliot Richmond followed by fade zoom slider. There are various other data attributes all coming from the hook use block props that was automatically set up with the create block package. You can also see that we've got a data title called fade zoom slider. Using the inspector to inspect and debug our block and utilizing console.log, it's essential to set up our custom WP config file correctly. While this doesn't have a major impact on the plugin, I always like to have a robust debugging setup. So I define WP debug as true. I also define script debug as true, which helps make scripts more readable by displaying the unminified version. I set up WP debug display to false and define WP debug log to a log file in my WP content folder named by date. I do this to avoid large log files taking up space, allowing me to delete them when I need to. It also helps identify when a bug was registered by its date, which I find really useful. Additionally, I set up the WP environment mode to all. This affects functional nuances in WordPress when making code changes, making it easier to debug while developing. Although I can set this to plugin or theme, I choose all because I want to ensure I debug pretty much every process in my debugging setup. So going back to our edit.js file, this is where we're going to do most of our work. We need to identify what we're actually going to build. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the link for the use block props that is coming from the block editor package. Now the documentation is constantly improving and getting better all the time with WordPress, especially for modern WordPress development and the block editor. But the documentation is widespread, and unfortunately you just need to dig around to find the information you need. That said, the block editor handbook on the developer.wordpress.org site is a great place to start. If the information isn't there, there will almost certainly be a link to a GitHub reference. So mostly the stuff I'll be looking at is in the package reference section, and specifically in the block editor package. And this is where you'll find all the block editor modules that you can import into your custom block. So in the block editor section, if you look at the API section on the right hand side, you'll see all of the modules available for integrating components into the UI. I know I need to use the media library since we're adding images to a gallery. I'm particularly interested in the media upload component. So by clicking on the media upload, you can access related documentation. And in this case, at the time of creating this video, we currently have a link to a GitHub README file. So this link takes you to the GitHub reference showing an example of how to import the component for triggering the media upload library. So to get the media upload working, you can use import media upload and media upload check from the WordPress block editor. So the media upload check ensures that the current user has upload permissions, and you just need to wrap the media upload component with media upload check. So I'll copy these hooks into my edit.js file. Now this component comes from the block editor package. So as I'm already importing the use block props from the block editor, I can just add them within the curly braces, and you can simply think of this as an array of items. And in my return function, I'll copy the example from GitHub and paste it in. If everything goes smoothly, my terminal won't show any errors, and everything will be built and compiled into my build folder. Now I'll check this in the back end of my site. Now refreshing the page might break the block if the database content differs from the compiled code, so I'll add my block again. Now if there are any errors, use the inspector and console to find issues. And here there's a reference to allow types, and that is a variable that's not being defined, so I need to set that. And by checking the documentation, I can see that the allow types props is an array of meme types for the media library, things such as text, image, audio, video, etc. So for this custom block, all I'm interested in is images. So in the code, I'll define a constant variable equal to allow types, and this will be equal to an array, and I'll reference image, and this will allow me the flexibility to add more meme items later on down the line if I want to. So after saving the file, if there are any errors, check the inspector and the console again, and it says media ID is not being defined. So I'll need to correct this. So in the example, the value property is being set as a variable media ID, and this is the data that will be saved with the block to reference the image or images. So for now, I'll just remove the prop and save the file and pop back to my browser to refresh the page, and I still have an error. So again, checking the inspector and the console again, now there is a button that is not being defined. So what this means is that I'm not actually importing the component for the button. So pop back to the documentation, and in the example there's a reference to the button component, but this time the import is coming from the WordPress components. Now this is just the nature of the way that the documentation works at the moment, so you do need to dig around like I said earlier. So simply copy and paste this into my file, and importing the button component will ensure that all dependencies are included. So now I'll save the file and everything should compile correctly, and refreshing the page should render the block with a button that opens the media library. Perfect. So at the moment we've got the fundamentals set up. However, if I click the button to grab images, I can only select one at a time, and I need to change some settings for the media upload component. So I'll go back to my code, and using Command on my keyboard, click the link to go to the documentation to check what parameters I need to add to allow the selection of multiple images and display them in a gallery. So in the API section, find the media upload component, click the link to the GitHub reference, and in properties I can see a parameter for multiple which says whether to allow multiple selection files or not. So I need to add multiple as a property to my media upload component. Additionally, I also want add to gallery, and the documentation says if true, the gallery media modal opens directly in the media library where the user can add additional images. If false, the gallery media modal opens in the edit mode where the user can edit existing images by reordering them, removing them, or changing their attribute. So this seems really useful, so I'll add this to my component as well. And I also need the gallery property, and the documentation says if true, the component will initiate all the states required to represent a gallery. So by default, the media modal will open in the gallery edit frame, but that can be changed using the add to gallery flag. So I'll add this as well. Now I should have a button that opens up the media library with these settings. However, there's one thing I need to change with my button because I can't actually see it in the back end. So the background of the block in the editor is blue, and I think the button is also by default set to a link rather than a button, therefore I can't actually see it. So I go back to my editor and change the CSS in my style.scs file and remove the background color just to check if I can see the button. So after removing the background, I'll refresh the page. Now there is a button there, but it's not displaying correctly. And this is because I haven't set the button variant. So again, go back to the WordPress documentation and specifically the components package. And on the right hand side, you'll see a link to docs and examples. Now this takes you to something called the WordPress Gutenberg storybook. And this is really handy for viewing UI components and their properties in isolation. So locate the component for button, and according to the documentation, there is a variant property that specifies the button style. So by default, it's set to link, and I want it to be set to primary. I'll copy the example from the documentation and update my button with variant equal to primary. Then I'll go back to my editor, apply these changes, and save the file. And when I refresh the page in the back end, I should now see the button correctly. So now we can start testing multiple images. By adding images to a gallery and inserting the gallery, we can begin to see how this works. So at the moment we don't have any information because we're not actually saving any values. So with my inspector open, I'll check for any errors. There are no errors, but something is being logged as selected 6. So looking at the media upload components on select event, which comes from the example I copied earlier, it's console logging the selected media length. Now this indicates that something is happening, but we need to save this as part of the block. Now to do that, I need to add a value equal to the image ID. So back to the code editor, I need to declare a constant for my images, which will use the block's attributes. I'll define a constant called images that will be deconstructed from the attributes. Put simply, this is a way of extracting properties from an object. So we also need to ensure that the attributes are defined in our block.json file and pass these attributes to the edit function via an object. I'll declare the constant in the edit function and also ensure to pass the internal function set attributes, which will be used to update the block's attributes with the user's interaction on this block. And this will allow us to save the selected images. So next I need to define the attributes in the block.json blog.json file. So under the supports section, I'll add the attributes. And this is an object in JSON format where I'll declare the images attributes and set the type to array and set the default value to an empty array. Now this setup ensures that the block is configured to handle an array of images. Now back to the edit function, I can extract these attributes into the value property of the media upload component, referencing the images. I'll use the JavaScript map function to iterate over the images array, essentially creating an array of objects, and use an arrow function to define each image by its ID. Next, I'll update the onSelect handler. So instead of logging the selected media length, I'll set the attribute. The onSelect event is called when media is selected and the selected media are passed as an argument. This is where we can use set attributes to update the images array with the selected media. This will ensure that the selected images are saved to the block's attributes images array. So after saving these changes, I'll go back to the browser and refresh the page. And selecting multiple images and adding them as a gallery should now update the attributes correctly. To verify this, I'll console log the images array, refresh the page again, and check the console. And when I select images and add them to the gallery, the console should log the updated images array, confirming that the images are correctly being handled. However, I can't actually see the images rendered on the page yet. Now to fix this, I need to render the images in the UI. So again, using the JavaScript map function to iterate over the images array, we'll use an arrow function here to loop over the image items. I'm going to wrap this in a div element and give it a class name of slide. Now when you use class names in React, there's a special property called class name in camel case, and we'll set this equal to slide. I'll add an image tag with the source URL and the alt text. Now let's save that and go back to the browser and refresh the page. Now we can render the images, though the styling and the CSS still need to be fixed, but we'll come to that shortly. Now I just want to add the alignment support and add flexibility when using this block. So I'll go to my block.json file and add the alignment setting under the support section. Setting the alignment to true will enable the alignment tool in the block settings toolbar. So after making these changes and refreshing the page, I need to add the images to the gallery again. And now the alignment tool should be available to use, allowing me to set the alignment of the gallery. Now by default it's set to none, but I can change this to whatever's available in the theme. Another feature I want to add is the aspect ratio support. And to do that, we'll go back to the code editor and open up the block.json file. And under the support section, we'll add dimensions and the aspect ratio setting. So I'll set the aspect ratio to true and also add min height for more flexibility when adding images in this gallery block. So let's save the file, go back to the browser, refresh the page and add some images again to the gallery. Now we can see the aspect ratio option. However, there's no styling applied yet. And if we inspect the element, we can see that the parent element has inline styles for aspect ratio defined by the block editor setting. As I change these settings, you'll see that the element's aspect ratio updates. And we also have the min height settings, which can be adjusted, although we don't see any immediate changes because we haven't added the CSS styling yet. Next, let's add the CSS for both the editor and the front end. So back to the code editor, and in my styles.scs file, I'll add a slide class. I'll set the width and height to 100%, its opacity to 0, since we'll be using JavaScript to fade the transition between images, and set the transition timing for the opacity to 1 second with an ease in and out. This will handle the transition between images when using JavaScript, so I'll also set the overflow to hidden and position it to absolute, and this will transition images on top of each other and avoid any bouncing images. So within this class, I'll style the image element. Because this is SCS, the compiled CSS will maintain the specificity. Now I'll set the width and the height to 100%. I use object fit and set this to cover to ensure that the aspect ratio crops the image correctly, and add a transform scale of 1 for the starting point of my zoom effect. I'll set the transition for the transform to 4 seconds with an ease in effect to create a smooth zoom effect as we transition between images. I'll position it absolutely, aligning it to the top and left of the parent div. Now I'll add a toggle class called active, which I'll use in JavaScript to create the zoom fade effect. Now if the class is active, I'll set the opacity to 1 and make the image visible, and transform the image to scale up slightly to about 1.1, creating that slight zoom effect. So this covers the CSS for the front end, and for the back end CSS, I'll adapt it slightly. Now I want all the images to sit on top of each other without using any animation effect, so I'll set the slide opacity to 1, and that'll make the images visible. So let's save the file and ensure there are no errors in the build process. And then going back to the browser, I'll refresh the page and add the images again to see how the styling looks. Now the height is slightly off due to the min height parameter, and we can adjust it. And since we've set the object fit to cover, the crop will adapt based on the min height that is set. And we now have access to the aspect ratio settings, and changing these will adjust the aspect ratio of the images. So everything looks good. We now have enough flexibility in the slider to make changes and adapt to whatever needs we have. Now we got the images in a gallery, but one thing we can't do is remove images from the UI or the user interface. So I'm going to add another button specifically for removing images. So we'll place the button either at the top or the bottom. So let's go back to the code editor to implement this. So I'll add a button immediately after each image is rendered. And this button component will have a property called isDestructive. And this will allow us to remove preceding images. So additionally, I'll need to add an onClick event, and this will call a function that handles the image removal. And I'll pass the index value of that image. I'm going to place a function here called removeImage. So I'm going to take the index value from the iteration of the map function. So with that done, I just need to close off the button component and give it a literal prompt, which will be remove. Now I need to create the remove image function. So I'll define it just at the top of my return statement. I'll create a const value for the function name, and this function will accept the index parameter from the map function. And this index will be used to filter the images array. So I'll create another const called newImages using the filter method that creates a new array with all the elements that pass the condition used in the arrow function. So the condition I not equal to index will only include images except the ones specified by the index value. So the newImages variable will be a new array without the one that's been removed. Next, I'll use the setAttributes function to update the original images array with the new images array. This way, when the button is clicked, it will remove the images corresponding to the clicked index and reset the images array. After saving the changes, I'll return back to the block editor, refresh the page, add 3 more images, add them to the gallery. If you can't see the button, it's likely due to a CSS issue. By inspecting the element, I can see that the button is being pushed underneath the images because of the absolute positioning. So I could use the already rendered classes like components button or isDestructive and set an absolute positioning for these classes in my editor CSS, but I don't want to affect all the buttons throughout the site where they may be used. Therefore, I need to add a unique class to this button so that I can just target this button. So back to the editor, I'll find the button and add a class name called removeFadeSliderEMG to target just this button without clashing with any other buttons on the site. So after saving, I'll refresh the page again, add more images to the gallery, inspect the element. Now I should see a button with the new class removeFadeSliderEMG. So I can copy this back to my editor, add it to my CSS file. Now I can set the positioning to absolute and add bottom and right properties with 1em just to give it some space. I'll give it a different background color, perhaps a light pink instead of this harsh red, and slightly adjust the opacity so it's noticeable but not too intrusive in the UI. So after saving these changes, I'll go back to the block editor, refresh the page. I'll just close the inspector. I'll re-add some images to the gallery, and after inserting the gallery, I should see the button. Now there might be a little bit of tweaking needed here. So at this point, you might want to adjust the color of the button, make it more or less prominent, because obviously the contrast of the image will affect how the button looks, but we can refine it as we go along. Now when I click the button, it should remove the images from the top, working down through the gallery. Perfect. Now we can add and remove images. So now we're in a good place. So I'll just check the alignment and check that we can change the aspect ratio. Yep, everything's looking good. So all that remains to be done now is to ensure what is saved in the edit.js file is also replicated in the save.js file. And this guarantees that the content edited in the block editor or the Gutenberg editor is actually saved and rendered on the front end. If there are any deviations between the markup in the edit.js file and what's saved in the database, there will almost certainly be errors. So we need to copy what's in the edit.js file with all of its attributes and replicate them in the save.js file. And this involves adding the attributes from the block.json file as we did in the edit function and pass them through the save function in the save.js file. We also need to deconstruct the images array from the attributes and apply them to the markup in the return value for the save function. Now, the easiest way to do this is to copy the markup from the edit.js file, excluding all the components like the media upload, and the buttons. So essentially I'll copy the image map function as well and change the parent element to a div instead of a p tag, because that's what's in the edit.js file and will ultimately get saved to the database. Then I'll remove the button component since this is not needed for the saved version. So everything looks good. I'll save the file, go back to my editor and refresh the page, and there is an error. And this is because the previously saved markup doesn't match what is now coming from the save function in the save.js file. So in order to fix this, all I need to do is to remove the block from the content, refresh the page to ensure that my new code is loaded, and then just place the block again. So I need to find my fade slider block, add some images to the gallery, and check that everything is working fine, and it is. Perfect. The next step is to test the rendering on the front end. So if I refresh the page in the front end, we'll notice that nothing is rendered. But if we inspect the element, we can actually see that the markup is there, but something is missing due to the CSS. And this is because the slide class opacity is set to 0, and the opacity is set to 1 only on the active class. So to fix this, we need to create the JavaScript to loop through the class slide and toggle an active class one by one. So now if I go to the view.js file, which is what the block uses for any front-end JavaScript functionality, first I'll check that everything is actually loading correctly in the front end. So at the moment we have a console.log with a hello statement, and if we go back to the front end and inspect the element, we can confirm that the view.js file is actually loading in the front end because it's console logging the hello statement. So now I need to create the functionality for the slides. So I'll set a variable current slide to 0 to keep track of the current slide. Then I'll create a constant to grab all the slides by targeting the slide class, and another constant for the total number of slides called slide.length, which is a JavaScript function for counting the number of elements in an array. Next, I'll create a function called showSlide to loop through the slides, toggling an active class based on the index. If the index is equal to the current index, the slide gets an active class, otherwise the active class is removed. So I have a function that toggles an active class by running a for each on an array. Now I need to trigger that function to check if the index number matches the number in the array. Now to do this, I'll create another function called startSlider. This will trigger the showSlide function and take the current slide number as an argument. Now as it leaps through the for each, if the numbers match, it will toggle the class. So to automate this, we'll use the setInterval function, which triggers another function at set intervals in milliseconds. So if I set this to 5,000 milliseconds, that equates to 5 seconds. So every time this interval runs, I'll trigger the function called nextSlide, which I still need to create. So I'll create this function, and this function will increment the current slide number that was originally set to 0 initially at the top of the file, and use the modular operator to ensure it wraps around to 0 when it reaches the end of the number of slides in the array. For example, if there are 4 slides, it will reset to 0 after reaching the last slide, creating an infinite loop. So finally, I'll use an add event listener to trigger the start slider function when the DOM content loaded event fires. This means the loop will start as soon as the page loads and continuously cycle through the slides. So that's the JavaScript setup, and if everything runs smoothly, this should work. However, the CSS still needs adjustment, so I'll go back to my editor, set the aspect ratio to none, and debug the alignment issues. Now it turns out that the parent element needs a relative positioning, so after fixing that, everything should work as expected. And there we have the finished product. Now we have a slider with a Ken Burns effect and a custom block with settings for aspect ratio, alignment, as well as setting a minimum height. And this block can be placed anywhere on a page, or in a header, in a footer, or as a hero image. And that's my development process with WordPress for developing custom Gutenberg blocks. I hope I've at least inspired you to give it a try yourself, and of course if you've got any questions or suggestions, do leave them in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, please do give it a thumbs up, really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe for more content like this? Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.